Okay. So Luther, thanks for joining us. Could you maybe begin by telling us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing these days?
Yes, my name is Luther Steele, and I'm retired aerospace engineer, Boeing Company,
Hmm.
and I'm a native Detroiter. And when I retired, I was in Seattle Seattle and Charleston, both. And I decided to come back home. Detroit is my home.
Hmm.
Graduated Cass Technical University. I was at Wayne State University. I started in 1972.
Hmm.
I got drafted for Vietnam and had to drop out and go to war. And long story short, I retired as an aerospace engineer. And then when I got back here, retirement's not for everyone. Some people fish, hunt, whatever, play with the grandkids.
Hmm.
It wasn't for me. So I decided to go back to school. And so I'm in the Mike Ilitch School of Business program, MBA, and I feel alive now again. So I'm back in school, and that's basically me in a nutshell.
Yeah. Thank you. So tell me a little bit about growing up. Where did you grow up in Detroit? Where did your family live? Um, and what was it like?
We were the first Black family in our neighborhood. The neighborhood was Livernois and Grand River area.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we moved in, it was all white. And then 67, they had the riots.
Mm-hmm.
And all the white people left immediately
Hmm.
and never came back. And they sold all their homes, furniture intact, everything. They just closed on their back. They left. It was a riot. They left for fear of their life. Pack what you can and hit 8 Mile.
Right.
And they just never came back. So the neighborhood changed, and that was 67. And then basically Detroit changed
Oh,
because they left.
you then. Sorry. How old were you then?
Um, I was just going into, I was in grade school. So I was in junior high, Tappan Junior High.
Uh,
Um, I started Cass Tech 2 years later, 69,
uh-huh.
in high school. So I was grade school concert trumpetist.
Very cool. Okay.
Yeah, so that's where I was at. So the whole neighborhood changed, Detroit changed, and all the banks, everything went south, north of 8 Mile. Immediately, the army came in.
Mm-hmm.
It was not a pretty sight.
Mm-hmm.
So that was me growing up there. And then we eventually, as dad got a better job, dad only had an eighth grade education.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the 40s and 50s, a black African American, you call us now, it was against the law to go past the eighth grade.
Mm-hmm.
You could only go to the eighth grade. So he had an eighth grade education, then he left and came up north and met my mother, and then I came along. But basically, he stressed education because of that. He
Mm-hmm.
couldn't do it. So it wasn't an option that I was going to go to college. Back in the day, you could hit kids back then. You can't now, but back then, it was the belt. You really didn't have a choice.
Mm-hmm.
So that was me growing up in Detroit. When the neighborhood changed, it changed into a bad neighborhood.
Were
So
you?
I constantly school was my refuge.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have to go back home. So I lived in the libraries and after school projects, anything to keep from going back home.
Mm-hmm.
And Cass Tech afforded me interest in the college and all of that. So it opened a lot of doors for me. So that was my growing up in Detroit was great.
Yeah.
Um, from a kid's viewpoint, but I think from an adult's viewpoint, it probably wasn't because my dad had to move around. It was racism. The police was shooting blacks. The thing they're doing now, this is nothing new. They was doing that back then. They just didn't have the cameras to show you it being done. So I imagine because there was signs that said no coloreds, don't even apply. So race, it was just, I can imagine as an adult, but as a child, it was great. Motown, we just used to hang out at the Fox Theater, watching the Motown reviews and the James Brown reviews, and all of Detroit was a mecca for music.
Still
Yeah.
is.
Yeah, it was just great growing here. I mean, I saw Bob Seger in Lincoln Park. He went to Lincoln Park High School. So we would go see Bob Seger band in the high school gym. And then Alice Cooper, he was in Ann Arbor. He grew up out there. We'd see him. So Detroit had a mecca of music, not just Motown. So it was great growing up here. It really was.
So, were you the oldest child?
Yes. A lot of responsibility in the old way of doing things falls on the oldest child. You're responsible for everything.
Right. So you mentioned, earlier during our conversation about how you instilled your dad instilled a lot of important family values within you, which still is really relevant to really how you make sense of the world around you in lots of ways. One is, of course, that education is so important. Another is that you need to be self-sufficient. Could you maybe go into a little bit more depth about that, about how you think your early life, your family experiences, and your histories might have shaped who you are?
Sure. My dad didn't encourage college. He believed there was no way for a Black man because they didn't hire Black people for thinking jobs. They did plumbing, carpentry, mechanics. Blacks were subject, even in the military. I'm a Tuskegee Airman. And a lot of the original Tuskegee Airmen, most of them are dead now, they spoke of how Blacks weren't even allowed to carry a gun. They cleaned the kitchen, to clean the latrines, fed the troops, things like that. So my dad discouraged me. He said, "What are you doing with this school?" My mom had a college degree from Eastern Michigan University back in the 50s. Her dad and family had college degrees. They are doctors from Meharry Medical College back in the 30s and 40s. But my dad's side are from Mississippi. They were sharecroppers. He came up north seeking a better life than Mississippi. The KKK actually chased him out of. He was born in Tupelo, Mississippi. They chased. Elvis was born there too. Just trivia. He was chased out. So he went from there through Beale Street in Memphis. Beale Street in Memphis, which is a tourist attraction now, but in the 40s and back then, that was where the drug dealers, rappers, that's where the hardcore pimps, players, they were on Beale Street. So Dad went to Beale Street and, he hopped a train, the box cars from Mississippi, took him a while. And he stayed in Beale Street for, I think he said a couple months. He hit on a crap game. He hit big on a crap game. My dad had some loaded dice. He was a zoot suit. He wore a zoot suit he was a street that was my dad. Okay.
He hustled. Yeah, sure.
He was a hustler. And my mom's a saint. Go figure. Opposites, right? And so he hit big, and came to Detroit because Ford Motor Company had jobs. And it was known in the Black community all through the South that he paid Blacks and white the same, $5 a day, Black or white. So a lot of Blacks migrated to the North. It was called the Great Migration. Most of the Blacks from Mississippi and Arkansas migrated to Detroit and Cleveland. The Blacks from Alabama, Georgia, they migrated to Chicago area and Indianapolis. So it was a great migration that came up. My dad came up. I remember I have fond memories as a kid of his brothers staying in my room until they got enough. They got a job at Ford, got a few checks, and then moved out, got their own place. And I remember all of them coming up, each one at a time, staying with us till they got established. So that was my dad's interpretation of education. He called it the white man's education. He said we'd be better off learning a trade. He was a Teamster. He believed unions did more for the Black community from 1900 all the way up. Because if you're a union member, it doesn't matter what your race is, you're a union member. So he was a Teamster, and he believed that get in there, be a journeyman, be an apprentice, tool and die or something, mechanic, and then you get your journeyman's card, and then you're set. So he came up through the unions, and he thought that education was a waste of time, the white man's education. But my mom stressed it because she knew the value of it. So they were constantly back and forth over that. So that was my dad's take on education, formal education.
So one of the jobs you held, because you've held so many, we were just talking about that earlier, but one of the jobs you held was working for the Detroit Water and Sewage Department as an engineer. Tell us a little bit about that part of your life, that phase of your life.
After 9/11, when 9/11 hit, I was in Wichita, Kansas, designing 767 turbojets for Boeing. And when 9/11 hit, Boeing canceled. It was like this virus. 9/11 changed everything. This kind of reminds me of that, where there's going to be a new normal. It's not going to be the same. When 9/11 hit, Boeing furloughed all of us engineers. So I came back home, Detroit. And I came back home, and my dad's health was failing. He died the next year, but his health was failing. And I got a chance to be with him every day because I collected unemployment. So I didn't have to work. So I would just go to the nursing home and be with him every day. And I cherished that. And then after he died, 2002, I says, okay, now what do I do? And the aerospace industry was not back up yet. 9/11, it took a few years, probably it'll take us a few years with this to actually get back to some normalcy. Well, anyway, I figured the safest job you could ever have is working for the government. That I know. They're always hiring, good times, bad times. They never lay off. And you got a great pension plan. So anyway, I went down to the city county building where that statue is. And back in the day, all of the jobs would be posted on a board. So I just caught the bus. I didn't even have a car. I caught the bus down there, and I'd go every day and look at the board, and I saw the Detroit Water and Sewage Department's hiring, and they need engineers. So I was just, this is great. So I went for the interview, aced that, and I wound up working for them. I was at, it's called, it's a famous restaurant now in Greektown, Fishbones. That building's owned by the Detroit Water and Sewage Department.
Huh.
So Fishbone is at the bottom, but the rest of the building is the Detroit Water and Sewage.
Uh-huh.
So I had an office in there and I'd walk around Greektown. It was great. That was just a great time. And one thing about federal jobs, you don't do anything. You don't, you're not in the private sector. You have to readjust. My first month, my coworkers had to sit me down and say, look, I got 3 years, 6 months, 2 hours to retire. We don't need any extra. Can we're a team. Let's work at our pace. Can you slow it down? And
This was a federal job, though, was it? I mean, you said
city government.
city.
City government. You have city, state. My mom is retired. She was a Wayne County sheriff.
Right.
So I have a lot of history where our family works for city, state, not federal government, but mostly I got a lot of family members that were prison guards. They get pension checks, you know. So I worked for the Detroit Water and Sewage Department. And one thing I found out is Detroit had the best water in the country.
Mm-hmm.
It's our filtration system. My job was to go to the Jefferson plant, all of the plants, and check their blueprints, check their drawings. Are they following the code? Are they doing what they're supposed to do? That was my job. So it's a lot of filtration, and it's very expensive. Detroit didn't have to do they could do like other cities and kind of half it up. Not so many filters, because you got these big circles of water, and then you have a big blade that comes along and scrapes the top. That's to skim that crap off the top. And then the good water settles down. The sediment goes to the bottom.
Right.
So you got a scraper at the bottom and a scraper at the top. And then the middle is what goes through the filters. Other systems don't have the scraper at the top and other things like that. So it's a very expensive process because of all of the processes to get that good water. Our water, we would test better than most bottled waters. Dasani, Nestle, all of them. Straight out the tap. We tested with their pH tests and all that. Ours was better. So there's a price for that. In my dad's time, water was free because we just took it out of the Great Lakes. We're very fortunate to have fresh water around us, not ocean, salt water. So we would just take that and we were fine. But because of all of the big three and the pollution and all the suppliers of the big three and the pollution, the waters got bad. And that's when we had to spend all this money putting fluoride in there for the teeth. Children's teeth were falling out. Had to put fluoride. I mean, I remember before fluoride, children's teeth were falling out. But when we started putting fluoride in the water, the children's health, we're talking mass health, improved dramatically. So all of the fluoride is very expensive. So all these processes that we didn't have in my dad's time, it costs. And when you add up those costs, water's not cheap. It's just not cheap. Not good water.
Right. So how long were you there for? How long did you work at DWSD? Did you get promoted? When did you eventually leave? Or I
worked there 2 years. Fantastic. I love it. And I got a job in San Diego.
Why did
Boeing called me back. Things got better.
Okay.
And Boeing in San Diego offered me a job, making at least 8 times more. Right. I was a 6-figure engineer.
Right.
So they threw me a fantastic party.
It's just too good.
Oh my God, they threw me the biggest. They gave me a leather brief
Oh,
with
geez.
my initials carved in it. Oh, it was just fantastic.
So,
Good people, good people.
so, thinking back, you have not worked with DWSD directly or the water folks in Detroit directly since then. Is that true?
That's correct. But in those 2 years,
Yeah.
I interacted with the unions,
Yeah.
the water unions. I was a heavy participant in all of the activities for the employees
Right.
and all of the processes for, I didn't just sit there like they wanted me to.
Right. Right. So I want you to maybe think back a little to those, to those experiences. And I know it's a while ago, but do any and especially when you think about what the culture of the organization was, and how things were done, how employees like yourselves were valued, how customers were valued, what was the guiding mission involved. What are some of your thoughts for some of these questions? Maybe take them one by one, I guess. Are there any experiences or incidents that stand out in your memory from that time in particular?
Yes, yes. Yeah. During the time I was there after 9/11, that's when the water jumped, the price. There was a lot of corruption. Kwame Kilpatrick was the mayor, and there was a lot of corruption. The chief of police wound up going to prison. So the Detroit Water and Sewage Department also had a lot of corruption.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened was a lot of people got their water shut off that shouldn't have because their bill money went somewhere else where it should not have went. And sure, they could prove that it didn't and all that, but in the meantime, your water shut off.
Right.
In that time period, I stopped taking Detroit water sewage vehicles. People would see the symbol, Detroit Water and Sewage Department, and try to hit me.
Wow.
Because they would pull up in front and then hit the brakes. So I could hit them from the rear. That's cash money. They would settle out of court, at least 10, 15 grand. I stopped taking the trucks because it just was too much going on. The city crack had took over the city. When I left, I thought I escaped Detroit, not just left Detroit. And the Detroit Water and Sewage Department was actually in court. Kim Worthy took them to court to try to bring out all this corruption. She cleaned up a lot of it, believe it or not. She's my classmate. We went to Cass together. And she was a hard-nosed then. But she cleaned up a lot of it. And unfortunately, the citizens of Detroit suffered. The citizens suffered. Not the people doing the bad shenanigans.
Right.
So that's why, and then the suburbs like Flint, they would say, why am I paying all this absorbent money when we could do something different? Flint tried to do something different and it was a disaster. But everybody, it wasn't just the city of Detroit that experienced the aftermath of corruption. It was the surrounding communities also, because they got their water from us, from the city of Detroit. It's a hub.